So is everybody secretly starting over in their 30s and 40s? It's a very, very common thing for us to look around and see people that are starting over in their careers and their relationships, in their lives. And I think this belief has to do with how we're actually taught. What was the educational goal that people were seeking within both, high school and then higher education if you got a college degree? It was to get people a job. It was to get them to be productive members of society. That's essentially what the true goal of education actually is to train people to become productive sort of servants of society. I know that sounds really terrible, but it's very, very true, right? Like, they are actually labor, and there is a lot of overlap between the people that taught in business schools. Unfortunately, I'm a business school professor, or fortunately, so I understand that the desire to become more productive, and there was a lot of transfer of knowledge and the sort of focus on becoming increasingly more productive in our society and ramping up. And so there's lots of investment in getting people to believe that there is a single career that you're based on. But this is based on a bit of a misnomer with all of this. Their goal is to get people out and to have a productive life. And what it often fails to neglect is that our lives are increasingly longer, and our lives are constantly changing. That there's a lot of flow of life experiences that happen that completely change who we are over the course of several decades. Now, if you can imagine, when you get out of school, most of us are trained in a certain environment. And that certain environment, after a few decades, if you look at the world around us, has changed a lot. When I got out of my school in high school, it was the late 1990s. There was no internet, or just the beginnings of the internet. There was no social media. There was no artificial intelligence. There was just at the tail end, essentially, of the industrial production society that was happening. We're going through a bit of a transition at that moment. And so the goal for me was to go and work in the pulp and paper mill that I worked in, or that I actually worked in, but my dad worked in for 46 years. And it was a small little town, and if I would have stayed with that, I would have lost my job, because the pulp and paper mill, unfortunately, has gone through a lot of downsizing because of technology. And I would have gone through a lot of different transitions because of that. And that's because we're being trained, and we believe that the world is really static at that moment, right? And instead, a better way to look at this is to accept the world as an ever-changing, just giant mess, right? So there's a fancy word for that we look into, and that we have models for. Its complexity, I'm not going to get into that, but basically it's just a giant mess. Nobody really knows what they're doing. There's all sorts of parameters that are involved. It is very, very difficult to understand what is going on in the world. And so if you view it in this way, what you realize is that after, say, a decade, maybe 2 decades, just at the tail end, so if you think about this, you're trained in high school. After a couple of decades, it'll be the 19th, you'll be 30, between your 30s and 40s, so you'll really start to notice that the world is completely different at that moment. I forget the guy's name, but this guy has this really great quote where he said that after 30 years, everything has changed in the world, and it's just because of technological progress. That includes institutions, for example, like marriage, government, those kind of things. We're going through an unusual transition in America where our institutions are changing, and completely changing compared to what they used to be. And I think some of that is pushback against It's pushed back against sort of technological patterns that have happened where certain people are left behind, or they believe. It's not necessarily that they are left behind because, essentially we're much more wealthier than we used to be, but some people believe that. But so, long story short is that these institutions change, the world is constantly changing, and after 20 or 30 years, that world that we were educated in and taught in is completely different. And it's been like that for a long, long time. Even predating, I suspect, the 1400s, when there was the Renaissance movement that was happening. Or imagine it was actually happening before that. Documentation is not as great at that moment, right? So all of this has been changing. And so what does that mean for you? Right? For you as an individual, that means it feels like after about, when you're in your 30s and 40s, it feels like you're out of date. It feels like you maybe should transition to something else. And instead of thinking about that there are these sort of periods in life that you should transition to, have a different view. Have a view where there is an evolving set of experiences that are constantly changing. Right? These experiences are always coming in and out of your life, and you're sort of recognizing what's happening every once in a while. When you have this set of experiences, what I want you to do is think about how can I adapt to this set of experiences so that any given moment I feel relatively okay. And the reason why I say relatively okay is because this adaptation always requires you to feel out of place at any given moment. So, let's say a percentage, right? A percentage of 25% of your life is going to feel out of place. And the reason is that you are looking into the future. And the future is not the status quo. It's something completely different. And because of that, your estimate of the future may be correct or may not be correct, but it's going to be incongruent. It's not going to fit with the current world that we live in. And so people are going to think that you're really strange, right? Like you might be taking courses in learning a new language. You might be taking courses or reading up on news, right? You might be doing all these different things that people are going to presume that you're a little bit unusual with this, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It just means that you are incongruent with how people in your surroundings, maybe it's your immediate surroundings or broader surroundings, don't quite fit in with that because you're someplace in the future, or your mind and your thoughts and intentions are someplace in the future. So that being said, what can you do ultimately is have a sense of, and I talk about this a lot on this channel, have a sense of feeling somewhat present, but also a little bit odd and a little bit weird, where you are incongruent. You kind of feel a little bit weird all of the time. That weirdness is not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. It means that you're learning, you're adapting, and it feels like you're doing the right thing. So one more thing that's really, really important. I just had this thought. It's not about feeling like it's the right thing. In fact, when you do things like that, it feels awful, right? It feels terrible. You feel out of place. You feel you're alone. You feel like an outsider. You feel all of these things. It just feels horrible the whole time. It does, right? But that means that you're actually learning and developing. When you go and learn a new language for the first time, when you begin, just like anything else, when you begin, you're awful. And people make fun of you. It sounds terrible. You sound like such a foreigner. But with practice, you get better. Now, does that mean that you will become completely fluent and everything will be perfect? No. Right? But you get a little bit better such that you can make a little bit less of a of a of a of a of an A of yourself and continue to move forward. And that's what it is. It's this making a little bit of an A of yourself constantly and taking steps forward day in and day out. And as well, trying to absorb all of this beautifulness around us that we call our current experiences. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.